growth. And with that, the future didn't seem so far away anymore. The spaceship was massive. It floated silently through the dark void of space, a giant machine carrying soldiers, engineers, and scientists from one planet to another. John, a human engineer, had spent most of his career working on ships like this. He was skilled at fixing things and keeping the systems running smoothly. But today, John was facing a problem he had never expected. He had just received his new assignment: to repair some critical systems on this ship. The task wasn't difficult, but the timing was. The crew quarters were overcrowded, and there weren't enough rooms for everyone. So, instead of a private room to rest after his shifts, John was forced to share a small cabin with another crew member. At first, John had no idea who his roommate would be. He expected another human, maybe a fellow engineer or a soldier. He didn't expect what happened next. When John entered the cabin, his eyes widened. Standing in the room was Skylara, an alien woman who looked like nothing he had ever seen before. Her skin shimmered with a faint blue glow, and her long silver hair flowed like water. She was tall and graceful, moving with the kind of confidence that made the air feel heavier. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught John off guard. It was the way she looked at him. Her green eyes sparkled with amusement, like she was already sizing him up. "Hello, human," Skylara said in a voice that was smooth and rich, with an almost musical quality. John blinked, his mind racing. He had been told there were a few aliens on board, but he had never expected to share a room with one, especially not one like her. "Hi," John replied, unsure of what else to say. "I didn't know I'd be rooming with you." Skylara smiled, and John noticed the way her lips curved, as if she knew exactly how much she affected him. He quickly looked away, feeling his face heat up. This wasn't a situation he had prepared for. Not in the slightest. "We are stuck together for the duration of the trip," Skylara said, her tone calm but knowing. "It seems that the human crew is a little crowded, so we make do." John nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. He wasn't sure if this was normal for the ship or if he had just drawn the short straw. All he knew was that the room felt too small now, the air too thick. The last thing he wanted was to feel awkward around her. "Right," he said, forcing a smile. "I guess I'll just stay on your side," she finished for him, her eyes never leaving his. John nodded quickly and grabbed his tools, heading to his bed. He had to keep his focus on work. He was here to fix things, not to get distracted by an alien woman who seemed to be playing games with him. But Skylara wasn't done with him. As he set his bag down, she walked across the room with slow, measured steps. She didn't have to say anything for John to notice how every movement she made was deliberate, almost hypnotic. He couldn't help but glance at her, and when their eyes met, he quickly looked away. "Don't worry, human," Skylara said softly, but there was a tease in her voice. "I'm not here to make things difficult for you." She leaned closer, and John's heartbeat quickened. "But if you want to make things easier, perhaps you could start by relaxing a little." John wasn't sure how to respond. Was she flirting with him? Was this just part of her alien charm, or was she playing some sort of game? He didn't know, but he wasn't about to give in. Not so easily. "I'm just here to work," he said, his voice steady even though his mind was racing. "Let's keep it professional." Skylara didn't seem offended. Instead, she simply smiled again, this time more genuinely. "As you wish," she said, sitting down at her own small workstation across from him. For the rest of the evening, John tried his best to ignore the fact that his new roommate was an alien woman who seemed to have an endless supply of charm. He focused on the ship's systems, making repairs and adjustments as needed. But every now and then, he couldn't help but feel her eyes on him, and it made his skin tingle. As the hours passed, John began to wonder if this strange arrangement was going to drive him crazy. He was used to being alone, working in his own space where he could focus. But with Skylara in the room, everything felt different. There was something about her, something in the way she looked at him, the way she spoke. It wasn't just the way she looked. It was the way she made him feel. And that made him nervous. He wasn't here for distractions. He was here to do his job, and that was it. But Xelara wasn't giving him a chance to forget about her. Every time he looked up, she was there, watching him with that knowing smile. She was a mystery, and for the first time in a long while, John felt the need to solve it. As he finally lay down to sleep, trying to shut his mind off, he heard a soft voice in the dark. "Good night, human." John swallowed hard, unsure if he could trust his own feelings. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. But for now, he closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would be another day of awkwardness, work, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Working together. The next morning, John walked into the ship's engineering bay, ready to get to work. The ship was old and needed a lot of repairs. As he passed through the hallways, his mind kept drifting back to last night. Sharing a room with Xelara was strange. The way she had looked at him, the way she had spoken. It wasn't something he could easily forget. But today, he had to focus. There was no room for distractions. When he entered the bay, he saw Xelara already at work, her long silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She was standing near a large control panel, examining the ship's power systems. The way she moved was fluid, almost like she was in perfect harmony with the ship. John couldn't help but watch her for a moment. Xelara noticed him as soon as he entered. She didn't smile this time, but there was something in her eyes that made John feel uneasy. She didn't seem to care that they were still strangers to each other. It was almost like she was perfectly comfortable with the situation. "Morning, human," she said, her voice soft but carrying the hint of amusement. John nodded, trying to shake off his nerves. "Morning. I'll start with the engine coolant systems. You take the power grid, right?" Xelara tilted her head, as if she were considering his suggestion. "I could," she said slowly, "but I think it would be better if we worked together on both tasks. That way, we finish faster." John didn't like the idea. He was used to working alone, and sharing responsibilities made him feel out of control. But Xelara was right about one thing. They did need to get things done quickly. The ship's power systems were in bad shape, and if they didn't fix them soon, they could end up stranded in space. "Fine," John said, trying to sound confident. "Let's do it your way." As they worked side by side, John kept his focus on the task at hand. He didn't want to be distracted by anything, but it was hard not to notice the way Xelara moved, the way she handled the equipment like it was second nature. She was graceful, skilled, and confident. It was clear she wasn't just a pretty face. She was capable, and that impressed John more than he wanted to admit. "Do you always work this fast?" John asked, breaking the silence. Xelara looked at him, her green eyes glinting with curiosity. "I've had a lot of practice," she said with a shrug. "I'm part of an elite team, remember? Efficiency is key." John nodded. He had no doubt about her abilities. The problem was, working next to her wasn't as easy as he thought. She seemed to know exactly where to place her hands, exactly how to move. Every time she reached for a tool or adjusted a panel, it felt like she was a little too close, and it threw him off. Trying to keep his distance, John focused on his side of the job. But he couldn't deny that Xelara was good at what she did. She was always 3 steps ahead of him, always anticipating the next problem before it even came up. They worked silently for a while, and John tried his best to ignore the tension building between them. But it wasn't easy. Every time their hands brushed against each other, he felt a jolt of electricity shoot through him. It was like his body was betraying him, reacting to her even though his mind was telling him to stay focused. "Are you always this quiet when you work?" Xelara asked, her voice breaking through his thoughts. John glanced over at her, a little surprised. "I'm just focused," he said, trying to sound casual. Xelara smirked. "I see. Well, you're not the only one who likes to focus. But I'm not afraid of a little distraction." John raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Zalara didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her eyes locked on his. It wasn't the usual playful look she gave him. This time, it was different, more serious. I mean, she said slowly, sometimes distractions make things more interesting. John felt his pulse quicken. He had to keep things professional. But Zalara wasn't making it easy. The way she said those words, the way she looked at him, it was like she was daring him to respond. He cleared his throat, trying to get back on track. We should finish the repairs first, he said, focusing on the console in front of him. But Zalara didn't back down. Of course. But I like to think that the work can be just as exciting as the company you're keeping. John didn't know how to respond to that. It was hard enough keeping his thoughts focused on the job, but now, with Zalara's words hanging in the air, it was even harder. The ship was on the verge of falling apart, and yet his mind kept wandering back to her. It didn't help that every time they worked side by side, he felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't control. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they finished the repairs. The engine coolant system was fixed, and the power grid was working again. The ship would be fine. For now. John wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Zalara. That wasn't so bad, he said, trying to sound relieved. Zalara smiled, but it wasn't her usual playful grin. This time, there was something more sincere in her expression. I told you it wouldn't be. John nodded, but he wasn't sure if he was talking about the repairs or something else entirely. As they packed up their tools and prepared to leave the engineering bay, John couldn't help but feel like the situation between him and Zalara was far from over. Something had shifted between them, and he wasn't sure if it was a good thing or a bad one. He wasn't sure of anything anymore, but one thing was certain. Working with Zalara was going to be a lot more complicated than he had ever imagined. A close call. The day started like any other. John woke up early, stretching his arms as he prepared for another shift. He had gotten used to sharing a room with Zalara, and though things were still a little awkward, they had fallen into a routine. They worked together during the day, fixed the ship, and exchanged a few words in passing. Nothing too personal, nothing too complicated. But today was different. As John walked into the engine room, he felt the usual hum of the ship beneath his feet, the steady sound of machinery working. Zalara was already there, her hands on a control panel, her face focused. He couldn't help but admire the way she worked. Every move was deliberate, every step confident. For a moment, he forgot why they were even here. On this mission, in space, he just watched her, captivated by her skill. Ready to start? John asked, shaking himself out of his thoughts. Zalara didn't look up at him immediately, but nodded. I'll handle the engine diagnostics, she said, her voice calm as always. You check the cooling system. John nodded, already moving toward his station. The work was important, and there was a lot to do. The ship's systems weren't in the best shape, and if they didn't fix things soon, they might find themselves stranded in the middle of nowhere. As the morning passed, John worked on his side of the task, trying to ignore the occasional glance at Zalara. But as the hours ticked by, things began to feel off. There was a strange vibration in the air, something that didn't seem quite right. The ship shook a little more than usual, and the sound of the engine seemed to grow louder, more intense. Something's wrong, John muttered to himself. He walked over to Zalara. His eyes narrowed. She was still at her console, but now she was looking at the screen with a frown on her face. Zalara, John said, his voice a little more urgent now. Do you feel that? There's something wrong with the power systems. Zalara glanced up at him. I know, she said, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. I've been tracking the fluctuations. There's a short circuit somewhere in the core. If we don't fix it now, it could cause a serious malfunction. John's stomach dropped. The core malfunctioning was one of the worst things that could happen on a ship. It could lead to a catastrophic failure. and they'd be dead before they even realized what was happening. "We need to get to the main reactor," John said quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Now." Solara nodded, already moving toward the door. "Follow me." They ran through the narrow hallways, their footsteps echoing in the quiet ship. As they reached the reactor chamber, John felt the ship shudder beneath him, the lights flickering. The alarm didn't go off yet, but he knew they were running out of time. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. Inside the reactor room, the air was hot, thick with the smell of metal and machinery. The main reactor was in the center, surrounded by panels of wires and glowing circuits. John didn't hesitate. He moved to one side of the reactor, quickly checking the controls. Everything looked fine, at least on the surface. Solara was already at the other side, her hands moving quickly over the control panel. "There it is," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "The short is in the central power core. We need to reroute the power and isolate the damaged circuits." John's mind raced. "Do it," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But as Solara worked, the ship gave another violent shake. The lights flickered again, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. Something was wrong, and it was happening fast. "Solara, hurry," John shouted, his voice edged with panic. Solara didn't answer, but her fingers flew over the panel, rerouting circuits, pressing buttons, doing everything she could to stop the malfunction. John watched her work, his heart in his throat. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. And then suddenly, everything went dark. The ship's lights cut out completely, leaving them in pitch-black darkness. "Solara," John called out, his voice sharp with fear. "What happened?" "I'm working on it," Solara replied quickly. "Hold on." John's breath came in quick gasps. Without the power, the ship was nothing more than a floating hunk of metal. He didn't know how long they had until the power came back online, or worse, until the reactor exploded. In the darkness, the silence was deafening. The only sound was the soft clicking of Solara's fingers on the control panel. John felt completely helpless, standing there in the dark, waiting for something to change. And then, just when he thought they were done for, the lights flickered back on. The reactor hummed to life. John exhaled in relief, his body sagging with the weight of what had just happened. They had done it. They had stopped the malfunction just in time. Solara stepped back from the console, her face as calm as ever. "It's fixed," she said, her voice steady. "The power's back. We're safe." John looked at her, his chest still tight from the adrenaline. "That was too close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Solara gave him a small, knowing smile. "You get used to it." But John wasn't sure he ever would. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The ship was silent, everything back to normal. But John couldn't shake the feeling that they had just come close to losing everything. And that, for some reason, made him feel closer to Solara than ever before. As they left the reactor room, John glanced at her again. The tension between them had changed. It wasn't just about fixing the ship anymore. Something had shifted, and now, more than ever, he couldn't ignore the connection growing between them. Teasing turns into something more. The days that followed were full of work. The ship still needed plenty of repairs, and both John and Solara were kept busy. They spent more time together in the engineering bays and control rooms, fixing what was broken and making sure the ship was safe to travel. But now things felt different. The tension between them had grown. It wasn't just the usual quiet exchanges anymore. It was something else, something neither of them could ignore. Every time John caught Solara's eyes, he felt a spark, like electricity running through his veins. She was still the same confident, skilled alien woman he had first met, but now there was something more in her gaze. The way she smiled at him, the way she teased him. She was playing a game, and John wasn't sure if he was ready to play along. One evening, After another long day of repairs, they found themselves working side by side again. The ships hummed their only company. They had just finished checking the ventilation system and were moving on to the last few adjustments before calling it a night. Silara was standing near a console, her long silver hair spilling over her shoulder as she bent over a control panel. Her back was slightly arched, and the movement made her curves more noticeable. John couldn't help but notice the way her figure seemed to command the space. His heart raced as he tried to focus on the task at hand. "Need some help?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Silara looked up at him, her eyes flashing with amusement. "I can handle it," she said with a smile that made his stomach do a flip. "But you can keep me company if you'd like." John's breath hitched. He didn't know what it was about her that made everything feel so intense. It wasn't just her beauty. It was her confidence, the way she seemed to know exactly how to get under his skin. "I'm fine just over here," John muttered, trying to keep his focus on the ship's systems, but his eyes kept drifting back to Silara. The way she moved, the way she smiled, it was like she was challenging him, daring him to react. As if reading his thoughts, Silara leaned closer to him. "You look a little distracted," she teased, her voice soft but playful. "I'm just concentrating," John said quickly, feeling his face warm. He didn't want to admit how much he was affected by her presence, how every little movement she made sent his mind into overdrive. "Concentrating, huh?" Silara raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "It doesn't look like that to me." Before John could respond, the ship gave a slight jolt. The lights flickered for a moment, and a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the ship. The sudden noise caught them both off guard. Silara stepped back from the console, and John turned toward the source of the sound. "What was that?" John asked, his voice tense. Silara didn't answer right away. She was already moving toward the door, her steps quick and decisive. "I'll go check it out," she said, her voice steady as ever. "Wait, I'll come with you," John said, grabbing his toolkit and following her. The two of them made their way down the hallway, moving toward the source of the noise. As they walked, the tension between them was almost palpable. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew something had changed. The way they interacted was different. There was a charged feeling in the air, an unspoken understanding that they both knew about, but neither was willing to acknowledge fully. They reached the damaged area, where the main power conduit had sparked and caused a short circuit. The room was dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Silara moved quickly, already starting to assess the damage. John moved to the other side, checking the wiring. "Do you need help?" John asked, his voice low. Silara didn't look up, but she smirked. "I'm fine, human. But it seems like you're more interested in helping me than fixing the ship." John felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. He wasn't sure if she was teasing him or if she was actually trying to push his buttons. Either way, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he wasn't noticing everything about her. "I'm just here to make sure the job gets done," he said, trying to sound professional. But inside, his heart was pounding. Silara didn't respond right away. She was still working, her hands deftly repairing the wiring. John focused on his task, but the sound of her voice broke his concentration again. "Maybe you're just trying to distract me," she said softly, her tone teasing, but with a hint of something else, something deeper, something that made John's pulse quicken. "I'm not," John said, his voice coming out a little more sharp than he intended. "I just want to finish this. We're almost done, right?" Silara paused, her eyes flicking to his. She took a step closer, and the space between them suddenly felt too small. "Maybe we are," she said quietly, her lips curving into a slow, seductive smile. "But sometimes it's more fun to make things last a little longer." John's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't deny it anymore. There was something between them, something more than just work, something that was starting to feel like it couldn't be ignored any longer. Before he could say anything, Silara reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. The touch was light, but it sent a shiver down his spine. "Are you sure you're not just trying to distract me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, and John's mind was racing. He knew he should pull away, keep things professional. But everything about this situation felt different now. John started, but the words caught in his throat. Silara stepped closer, her eyes locking with his, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world was suspended in time. Then, without another word, Silara leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, teasing kiss. John's heart slammed in his chest. This was happening. It was no longer just about the ship, the repairs, or the work they had to do. It was about them. The line between what was professional and what was personal had disappeared. The truth comes out. The days after the kiss were filled with confusion and silence. Neither John nor Silara spoke about it. It was like the moment had never happened, as if the electric tension between them had been forgotten the moment the ship's systems demanded attention again. They both fell back into their routine, working together on the ship, but now, everything felt different. John couldn't stop thinking about that kiss, the way her lips had brushed against his, the way the room had seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. It had been quick, almost like a dream, but it was real. It had happened. And Silara, she wasn't acting any different. She still teased him when they worked together, still gave him those little smiles that made his heart skip a beat. But there was something else behind her eyes now. A quiet tension that hung between them, like an unspoken truth neither of them were willing to acknowledge. It wasn't until a few days later that John couldn't take it anymore. It happened after another long shift. The two of them were walking down the hallway, heading back to their shared room. The ship was quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound. John had been keeping his distance all day, but now, in the silence of the hallway, he found himself walking beside Silara again, the same strange pull drawing him toward her. "Silara," he said, his voice low. She glanced at him, but didn't say anything right away. "What is it, human?" she asked with that usual teasing tone, though there was something softer in it now. "I can't keep pretending like nothing happened," John said, his words coming out quicker than he intended. I don't know what's going on between us, but I can't ignore it anymore." Silara stopped walking and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence. John felt his heart race, unsure of what to expect. Would she brush it off, laugh it off, or would she say something he didn't want to hear? But then she sighed and looked down for a moment, her silver hair falling over her face. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice soft. "We can't pretend." John frowned. "So, what now?" Silara met his gaze again, her green eyes bright with something John couldn't quite understand. "You want the truth?" she asked, a small smirk playing on her lips. John nodded, feeling his stomach tighten. "Yeah, I think I deserve it." Silara stepped closer, her presence somehow commanding the small space between them. "The truth is, I didn't plan this. I didn't plan to kiss you. But it happened," she said, her voice steady, but there was something vulnerable in her tone that John hadn't expected. John swallowed hard, trying to process her words. "Then why? Why did you kiss me?" Silara hesitated before answering. "Because I couldn't stop myself. I didn't expect to feel this way. But being around you, it's different, and I thought maybe it was just a passing thing. But now, I'm not sure." John's heart pounded in his chest. The way she spoke with such honesty, it was a side of Silara he hadn't seen before. It was like the walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, and in the process, she was letting him see her. "Silara," John started, his voice trailing off. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to pull back, keep things professional. But the other part of him, the part that had been fighting these feelings for days, wanted to know more. He wanted to understand her. He wanted to understand what this was between them. Silara took a deep breath, her eyes scanning his face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "You don't have to say anything," she said, her voice gentle now. "I just needed you to know the truth about why I did it." John felt a knot in his stomach loosen, and for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. "I don't know what to think," he admitted. "This whole thing, it's been confusing. But I can't deny it either. You're different, Silara. And I don't know how to handle it." She smiled then, a real smile this time. "I don't think either of us knows how to handle it. But maybe that's okay." John looked at her, the words he had been holding in for so long finally slipping out. "I don't want this to be a mistake. I don't want us to keep pretending that we're just coworkers, or that this thing between us is nothing. It's real." Silara took another step closer, her gaze intense. "Then let's stop pretending. Let's just figure this out together. We don't have to rush it, but we don't have to hide from it either." John nodded, his heart beating faster than it had in a long time. "I don't know what will happen next, but I'm not going to pretend anymore." They stood there in the hallway, the ship's hum in the background, both of them facing the unknown. For the first time since they met, John felt a sense of clarity. The truth was out now, and whatever came next, they would face it together. They might not know what the future held, but they were done hiding from what was between them. Silara reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like everything had changed in that one touch. "I'm glad you're not running away," she said softly. John smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Me too." They walked back to their room together, the tension between them now a quiet understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it head-on. No more secrets. It was a new beginning, for both of them. A moment of trust. The days after their conversation were quieter, but a new kind of peace had settled between John and Silara. There was no more confusion or awkwardness. Instead, there was a feeling of understanding between them, a silent agreement to take things one step at a time. Their work continued, but now it was accompanied by small smiles, soft glances, and the occasional touch that spoke louder than words ever could. John felt like something had shifted. He had been fighting his feelings for so long, but now that the truth was out, it was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. There were still moments when he caught himself wondering if he was doing the right thing, but whenever he looked at Silara, the doubt seemed to fade. She wasn't just the alien seductress who had caught his eye. She was someone real, someone who was just as confused, just as unsure about what was happening between them. One afternoon, after a long shift working on the ship's engine systems, they found themselves alone in their shared room. The ship was quiet, the hum of the engines vibrating through the walls. It was late, and the only light came from the soft glow of the control panels that lined the walls. John was sitting at the small table, scribbling notes into his datapad. Silara, as usual, was sitting across from him, her focus on a repair manual. The usual silence filled the room, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was calm. "John." Silara's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. He looked up from his datapad, meeting her gaze. She was staring at him with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice quiet. Silara hesitated for a moment, then placed the manual down and leaned back in her chair. "I know we haven't really talked about everything that happened, but I wanted you to know something." John's heart beat a little faster. "What's that?" "I trust you," Silara said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I've been through a lot in my life, and trust doesn't come easily to me. But with you, it's different. I feel safe here with you." John felt a lump form in his throat. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Trust. It was something he had never thought he would earn from her, not in a million years. But now, hearing her say it, he realized just how much it meant. "I trust you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've never met anyone like you, and after everything, I know that we're not just here by accident. Whatever this is, it feels real." Solara smiled, a soft, warm smile that made John's heart swell. "I didn't know what to expect when I first met you. You were so different from the others. But now, I don't know where I'd be without you." John felt his chest tighten. There was something in her words that made everything feel so raw, so real. For the first time since meeting her, he didn't feel like he had to hold back. He didn't have to pretend anymore. Solara stood up from her chair and walked over to him, closing the distance between them. She stopped just in front of him, looking down at him with her bright green eyes, as if searching for something in his face. John could feel the heat of her presence, and the air around them seemed to grow thick with unspoken feelings. Without saying a word, Solara reached out and gently placed her hand on his cheek. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a wave of warmth through his body. He looked up at her, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was only the two of them. No ship, no mission, just the connection between them. "I don't want to hide anymore," Solara whispered. "I don't want us to be uncertain." John's breath caught in his throat. "Neither do I," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Slowly, Solara leaned in, her face coming closer to his. He could feel her breath against his skin, warm and steady. His heart raced as he closed his eyes, waiting for the moment to come. And when it did, when her lips brushed against his, everything in the world seemed to stop. The kiss was soft at first, gentle, as if testing the waters, but it didn't stay that way. As they deepened the kiss, their hands moved, hesitant at first, then with more confidence. The world outside the room didn't matter anymore. It was just them, in this small space, finding comfort in each other. In this moment, they weren't a human and an alien. They were two people who had found something real, something worth fighting for. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathing a little faster, their hearts pounding in their chests. John's mind was still reeling from the kiss, but the feeling in his chest, the warmth, the connection, made everything feel clearer than ever before. "I'm glad we're here," Solara said softly, her voice low and sincere. John smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too," he said. They sat there for a long time, neither of them speaking, but both of them knowing that something had changed. The walls between them had come down, and for the first time, they were truly trusting each other. It wasn't perfect. They both knew that. They had a long way to go, but in this moment, with Solara's hand resting gently on his, John knew that they were on the right path. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. No more hiding, no more pretending. It was just them, and that was enough. And for the first time since they started this journey, John felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Moving forward, the next few days on the ship were a mix of work and quiet moments. John and Solara had found their rhythm. The tension between them, once thick and hard to ignore, had melted into something softer, something real. They weren't just sharing a room anymore or working together on repairs. They were learning about each other, little by little, and with every passing day, it felt like they were growing closer. But not everything was simple. The ship still needed attention, and their time together was often cut short by work. The crew was always busy, and both of them had their responsibilities. Yet, whenever they could, they spent time in the quiet corners of the ship, talking, laughing, or just enjoying each other's company. Sometimes, it felt like the world outside didn't matter. There was only the ship, the mission, and the feeling between them. One morning, as they worked in the engine room, John looked over at Solara. She was focused on the control panel in front of her, her long silver hair falling in waves over her shoulder. She didn't notice him watching her, but he couldn't help it. There was something about her that drew him in. She wasn't just a skilled engineer. She was smart, strong, and had a confidence about her that made him admire her more with each passing day. "You're staring again." Lara said without looking up, her voice teasing. John flushed, feeling caught. I wasn't staring, he muttered, pretending to focus on the datapad in his hands. But he couldn't hide the smile on his face. Lara laughed softly. It's okay, human. I don't mind. John turned his attention back to his work, but the smile didn't leave his face. He had to admit he liked this side of her, the one that wasn't so serious, the one that could joke around. It made everything feel easier, less complicated. After a few more hours of work, they were finished with the repairs for the day. The ship was running smoothly, and there was nothing else that needed attention right away. John closed his toolkit and stretched, letting out a long breath. I think we've earned a break, he said. Lara raised an eyebrow. A break, huh? I didn't know you were capable of such things, human. John laughed, shaking his head. I know how to relax, believe me. They left the engine room together and headed down the long hallways. The ship was quieter now, the crew scattered throughout various parts of the ship, working or resting. It gave them some rare peace, and neither of them was in a rush to do anything else. So what now? Lara asked, her voice casual, but there was something deeper in her eyes. John paused for a moment, thinking. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe we just keep doing this, keep working together, and see where things go. He smiled. We don't have to figure everything out right away. Lara nodded slowly, her expression soft. I like that idea, she said. I think we can take our time. There's no rush. They reached the small lounge area where they usually ate their meals. The place was mostly empty, except for a few crew members sitting at tables, talking quietly. John and Lara took a seat near the window, looking out at the stars beyond the ship's walls. The vast emptiness of space was something they had both grown used to, but it never failed to remind them of how small they were in the grand scheme of things. And yet, in that moment, it didn't matter. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comforting. So, John began after a while. What happens when we get back to Earth? What happens then? Lara looked out the window, her eyes distant. I don't know, she said softly. I've never been to Earth. I don't even know what to expect. But I think we'll figure it out, one step at a time. John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Earth wasn't just home. It was full of unknowns, especially when it came to their relationship. What would people think of a human and an alien being together? Would it be accepted? Would it cause problems? There were so many questions, and no real answers. But John didn't feel scared. He felt something else, something more certain. The feeling between him and Lara had grown stronger every day. They had shared moments of trust, of vulnerability, and those moments meant more than anything else. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They had already crossed a line, one they could never go back from. Lara, he said quietly, his voice serious now, I know things aren't simple. I know the future isn't certain. But whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you. Lara turned to him, her eyes softening. I'm with you, too, she said, her voice steady and warm. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. John smiled, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Good, he said simply. They sat together for a while, watching the stars and letting the quiet surround them. Neither of them spoke much, but it didn't matter. They didn't need words to understand each other. They both knew the truth. They were moving forward, no matter what came next. As the day turned to night, the quiet of the